This is Drive with Anna Vidot on ABC Radio Canberra.
Just repeating the Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announcing, as I am speaking to you now, that Australian journalist Chang Lei has been freed in China. What an extraordinary development. I feel incredibly happy for her family. No doubt more details of all of that to emerge in the very near future, so stay tuned. Meanwhile, the roads around Canberra are incident-free. They are starting to look a little congested in some of the usual spots, including southbound on the Monero Highway past the AMC. But the good news north side, if you had been hearing about a grass fire, a small grass fire on the northern side of Mount Ainslie at Hackett, that is now out. You might still see some patrol crews just monitoring it and keeping an eye on it. If you do see them around, absolutely nothing to be alarmed by. The fire is out. Hooray for that good news. 1300 681 666 is the number to let me know if you do come across anything, though, happening on a road near you this afternoon. What you will probably be noticing around the city in the air near you is just how windy it is in this town at this time of year. And there do seem to be particularly windy spots in Canberra, reliably so. For instance, if you're one of the many, many Canberrans who've made a habit of doing the 5K bridge-to-bridge loop around Lake Burley, Griffin, you may have just found that it's a little harder to control your car door when you're opening it down the lake this time of year, and that one or the other direction might be particularly painful to walk due to all of the wind. So it did get us wondering, what is going on meteorologically, topographically, that makes this time of year very windy and the very windy parts of the city particularly windy? I am clearly no expert in this, but someone who is Dr. Matt Glanville, and he's the Vice President of CPP Wind Engineering Consultants. Matt, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for having me on the show.
I understand you are personally familiar with Lake Burley, Griffin. You've cycled around it before. Was it a particularly windy day on your visit?
I've got to be honest, I'm scratching my head a little bit to remember. It was quite a few years ago now. But look, I do seem to recall being fairly strong out in front of Questacon on that side of the river when we were riding around on that particular day. So I do sort of believe that the winds can be quite strong around those foreshores of Lake Burley, Griffin, particularly on the northern and southern sides because of your prevailing wind directions at this time of year, particularly your westerly winds.
Can you talk me a bit more about that? Like the big picture, first of all, for this part of the Australian continent, what is kind of happening at this time of year which does make it really windy?
Sure. Look, it happens right across the southeast quadrant of Australia, as you say. It's to do with the synoptic wind patterns. The combination of the differential between temperature across the surface of the Earth combined with the Coriolis effect, you get that circulation of winds from your high and your low pressures, and particularly when they converge, come together, you get the higher wind speed. So this time of year in particular, and it's not just Canberra, Sydney has exactly the same thing. Where our offices, our wind tunnels in Sydney. But we observe the same thing. It's the synoptic wind patterns in sort of late winter, spring, where we get these strong gale force winds, and they can last for days and days and days. So they're not sort of your short, convective type windstorm events like a thunderstorm downburst. You do have them in Canberra as well. You do have thunderstorm winds to contend with at the airport, for example. But your prevailing winds that people will notice around City Hill and your CBD district there are to do largely with those synoptic wind patterns in this time of year.
How long do these patterns continue? Do they last into summer typically?
Look, in Canberra, they'll will die off. This is sort of the windiest patch of the year, if you like, and you do have a contribution from your southeast winds as well. So, just in terms of, and that's often your low pressures sort of off the Tasman Sea Bass Strait. So, and that's again right across sort of the southeast part of the continent. But your prevailing wind directions really, as a result of all that. are kind of your westerlies at this time of year from the northwest as well into summer, and also your southeaster winds in summer as well, particularly the strong synoptic winds. And they're going to sort of align just with Lake Burley, Griffin, and some of the areas that we were talking about before, near the National Library and the High Court.
Let's talk a bit more about those then, Matt Glanville. And is there anything that makes that particular part of Canberra, that kind of corridor through Lake Burley, Griffin, extra windy? Is it just that it's a big open area, or is there something else going on that really contributes to that being super gusty?
Look, you just said it. That's basically it. It's the large exposure of Lake Burley, Griffin, and there's not a lot upstream in terms of there's obviously no high rise like we have in Sydney, or sort of larger scale development from either the southeast or from the due west in Burley Griffin to block those winds. So when the wind is coming from that direction, particularly from the west, it largely approaches the lake with its full strength, and then there's no roughness surface on the surface of the lake. It's just a water surface, and so there's nothing to resist the wind. In our urban environments, they actually slow the wind down at ground level. The wind flows over the earth in what we call an atmospheric boundary layer. If you can imagine, it's slow winds at the bottom around ground level, and wind velocities increase with height as you go higher. We'll all experience higher winds when we move up high-rise buildings. So it's windy at the top and the bottom. So there's this gradient of wind speed, you call it the boundary layer. And the boundary layer has a different shape depending whether it's going over smooth terrain or rough terrain. So the shape of a boundary layer moving over smooth terrain has very high velocities at ground level, and those velocities aren't so the rate of increase with height isn't so dramatic. So you get a concentration at ground level over water surfaces, large lakes, even the ocean. Once the winds hit land, and effectively a roughness, so houses, trees, even topography, hills, that perturbs the flow, reduces the velocity, but makes the wind more turbulent. So that's why when we go into the city centres in your Canberra CBD area as well, the winds won't be quite as strong as they are in Burley, it's Burley Griffin. They'll be lower velocity at ground level, typically, but more turbulent. So you will find you'll get occasional gusts near building corners where a jet of air finds its way through the cityscape and it accelerates around the building corner. It can be quite strong locally in places, but overall, the wind speed reduces relative to what it would be on Lake Burley Griffin.
Yeah, I reckon a few of us have probably had that experience. You know, walking along quite happily and then walk sort of past a crossroad, I guess, or to where it opens up and suddenly, vroom, you're just almost blown off your feet by a huge gust of wind. When we're talking about high-rise, Canberra, certainly over the last 10 or 20 years, but particularly over the last decade, has seen this real ramping up in construction. We've seen a lot of higher rise apartment buildings going in different parts of the city, for instance. How should developers, engineers think about wind when they're doing that kind of development and change to a city's landscape?
Well, that's where our consultancy, CPP Wind Engineers, gets involved. So planners putting up high-rise, during the early planning stages, the architects and designers will approach us with a design of their building, and we actually test the building on scale models in our wind tunnel in Sydney. So typically we'll build a model of a building. We did some over in Belconnen a couple of years back, some higher buildings, and we take those plans, we build a scale model of the development, we put it in our wind tunnel, and we model all the buildings surrounding the subject tower within about a radius of 500 metres in 1:400 scale. It's about a sort of 3 metre wide model. And it sits on this big circular turntable, and we can rotate that turntable to simulate different wind directions in the wind tunnel. We take the measurements around the base of the building. So what you're saying, you can get gusty spots near corners that can catch you unexpectedly. So we measure wind speeds on the scale model near the corners. So we know if you walk around the corner, the wind's coming from a particular direction, say prevailing wind direction, there is potential for a pedestrian to not only experience discomfort, but it could potentially be a safety issue for the type of winds that occur on an annual type basis, the strongest winds per year, if you like. So a big part of our business is taking those architectural plans, physically testing in our wind tunnel, we get the winds. From those measurements in the wind tunnel, we measure velocities on a probabilistic basis, so how windy, how often, if you like, and then there's third-party criterion we can use to compare what we've measured against acceptability in terms of human comfort. And we look at everything for comfort for outdoor dining. Is it going to be suitable, say, corner coffee shop at the base of a building, up to whether it's going to be unacceptable for those sudden gusts. And the higher the buildings go, the more potential there is for these strong gusts to occur. So, yeah, look, that's the core of our business, is doing these wind tunnel tests for environmental impacts.
When those issues are discovered, Matt, what can things be done in the design of the building or the broader design of that block or whatever that can address that? Or does it prompt a very significant overhaul in whatever the plans might have been for a particular block?
Yeah, look, there's a lot that can be done, and we've worked with the architects are fairly knowledgeable when it comes to wind engineering. It's really important for the amenity of their sites. So from previous projects, there is some experience with our excellent architects in Australia, but in terms of quantifying the numbers, we can provide, we can do the measurements in the tunnel. We can provide further experience, advice based on experience. And typically, if there is a problem, we might be looking at change of a building form. For example, podiums at the base of a tower are very effective. So if you have a high-rise tower facade, if you can set that back on the podium block so it doesn't go straight to the ground, it sits behind the podium. That's a great way to deflect any downwash winds that move down the facade away from ground level. Another mitigation strategy is to implement awnings. Again, for any sort of downwash flow where you get vertical momentum of the flow moving down facades towards the streets and potentially racing around the corners. We can put awnings at key locations to mitigate that. There's door setbacks, there's the type of doors even. Some doors require airlocks, revolving doors, so the wind can't penetrate from one side of the building through the building to the other side. There's also landscaping, planter boxes, vegetation, but vegetation is effective to a degree, but it can't be relied upon like hard building elements, such as screening and awnings. So look, there's quite a few things that can be done, and the earlier that we're involved, usually the better.
Matt, this has been fascinating to talk to you about it this afternoon. Thank you so much for, I guess, shedding a bit of light on the ways that you are thinking about wind and, I guess, explaining for us a little bit what we're seeing and feeling around our city too. Thank you.
No problem, man. I hope it was helpful.
It really was. Thank you so much. That's Dr. Matt Glanville, the Vice President of CPP Wind Engineering Consultants, talking about some of the reasons why